Okay. This slide is jinxed. Every time we put this bit of the PowerPoint on, something goes wrong. So. And it's actually ironic because it's not important. It's just a test. Okay, you remember I gave you a little test the day before yesterday. It seems a long time ago. So this is, I don't know if any of the British here are familiar with the panel game, the radio panel game, Round Britain Quiz, where the quiz master, I think it is a master, gives some very obscure clues, and the panel have to work out the connection. Well, this slide has never worked properly, but the idea is for you to see if you can establish a connection between the words of the song. We might even get the music in a minute with a bit of luck. Is that testing fake, you think? There's some music, and I will tell you the music is by Elgar, and it is not a catchy tune. The music is set to words, there we go, very quietly in the background. It's set to words by the gentleman whose name was not meant to appear until the crunch moment. But anyway, Roden Noel. And the connection with Janet Stewart is what I would want, please. From anybody who's brave. And if you get the answer right, you'll get a peppermint. But not now, because I've forgotten to bring them with me. So, the music is by Elgar. There's a poem by an obscure poet. Very famous piece of music, actually. And there's a connection with Janet Stewart. Hands up! Mary, congratulations! Yes. I'll tell you. Right, you can stop using that. I will give you. Mary got the answer right. No, well, I'm not here to make you feel foolish by giving you impossible questions. Roden Noel was the brother of Victoria Noel, who was Theodosia's best friend, if you remember, the one that Theodosia wrote letters to. Roden was a sort of second cousin once removed or something like that to Janet Stewart. And there's a book waiting to be written on him, but nobody else in this room apart from me is allowed to do it. He was a fascinating man. He was a poet who was in correspondence with Wordsworth, in Wordsworth's old age. He was a spiritualist. He was a friend of somebody called Edward Carpenter, who was a sexologist, a precursor. Well, he was somebody who influenced D.H. Lawrence and people like that, and was a very interesting man himself. Roden wrote some poetry. This is not his greatest example, about the elfin grottos and the elfin land. But he was an interesting man in his own right. And the more I read about Janet Stewart, the more interesting people there are to be dug up in her family. Not dug up literally, but to be found out about in her family. And Roden Noel was just one of them. And as Janet Stewart, as we know, tried her hand at verses, I wouldn't say she was a great poet either, but certainly she wrote lyrics for hymns and verses. I thought Roden was an interesting person just to connect with them. Okay, enough of him. You get a peppermint later on. So the rather dramatic title of this, I hope you won't be disappointed. Nothing very dramatic happens in this input, but I rather enjoyed this title, Slipping on a Frozen Sea, a Daring Mariner in Search of the Unknown. And what I was talking about this morning was Janet Stewart's connection, or her favouring of a rather traditional form, at least at the beginning, a traditional form of imaginative meditation. And I was saying how in some ways that approach to prayer suited her, and she never really gave it up. But her focus did change, and increasingly as the years went by, her emphasis was more and more on the unknown God, rather than a God you could in any straightforward way get in touch with by imagining gospel scenes. Perhaps because sea voyages, long and short, were so much a part of her religious life. From 1898, when she travelled with Mabel Digby to the United States, until her journey in 1913 to 14, when she visited Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, sea voyaging imagery crops up regularly in Janet's writings. In her essay on colour, with which I began this sequence of talks, and which was written in 1899, if you remember, soon after her return from America, she describes the developmental stage of the teenage years in terms of a journey of exploration. We are discoverers of our own lives, she says. And our journeys of discovery are undertaken by land or by sea. Either we are sailing towards new shores, daring mariners in search of the unknown, and day by day the horizon dips lower and our stars rise higher, or we are explorers by land and new wonders reveal themselves on each day's march. She was definitely of the sea journey camp, a daring mariner in search of the unknown, one for whom discoveries were made only after long waiting on high seas. This is important, for her spiritual life was not all plain sailing, though I don't want to over-dramatise it, as perhaps Maud Monaghan is guilty of doing towards the end of her book, where she goes on about Janet as one who was always intensely suffering spiritually. I don't think that was really the case, probably. Imaginative meditation was productive and helpful in many ways for Janet, but it couldn't completely satisfy her. And as a seeker of the unknown, its reassuring structures could at times function as constraints, or worse, even as barriers to being with the unknown. Moreover, her intelligence and her self-knowledge was sensitive to the possibility that imaginative meditation could be simply a form of self-hypnosis, the mind delighting in its own powers of imagination, watching a film. And if you get a bit carried away with that, perhaps, nothing to do with God at all, or not much to do with God at all. But there were further difficulties for her, especially with her lack of self-confidence at the beginning of her time as vicar, and during her voyage to Latin America on behalf of Mother Digby. She also had a tendency, as we've seen, to take herself too seriously and to overwork. As we might say now, she found it very difficult to pace herself. And these were all spiritual difficulties, or difficulties that had an impact on her spiritual life, that she experienced in the years 1894 to 1909, culminating in a sort of emotional crash in the June of that year. A crash that probably had more to do with simple exhaustion than anything more dramatic, but one that seems to have triggered a new phase in her ability to own her own spiritual voyage, to take the rudder herself. So in this session, I want to try to suggest some ways in which her apprehension of the unknown seems to have been transformed in her spiritual life. The first experience we know of was when she wrote to Galway in 1881, complaining of what he identified for her as spiritual desolation. His advice was to be patient, very traditional, very straightforward, textbook advice, to be patient, to hold firm to belief that God was present, and to continue to pray faithfully, perhaps even prolonging her prayer if she could. Get rid of the evil spirit in that way. Next, the fervour of her decision to enter the society seems to have been followed by a very rocky time adjusting to the constraints of the noviceship, after what had been, for the period, exceptional freedom of her years living with the Rosses in London. Much later on, in a letter to somebody called Catherine Ashburnham, who was at the time had just entered the noviceship, and who Janet had been accompanying. In this letter, she describes how she imagines Catherine to be feeling as somebody new in the noviceship, with an empathy it's hard to interpret as purely imaginative. And Janet writes to Catherine, "It interested me immensely to know that you were trying to acquire balance of mind and self-control. Did you not think before you entered that you had something of both? Only that first building goes down like a house of cards after one comes in, and has wept indignant and uncontrollable tears just when one wanted to be most superior to circumstances and other adventures of the same sort." I think that says as much about Janet coming to terms with the fact she wouldn't hunt again or couldn't go for a walk in the country on her own, as it does about Catherine. Mary Quinlan paints a striking picture of Janet as novice and aspirant, Mabel Digby's sort of secretary, following her around like a silent shadow, and perhaps inwardly, as Janet intimated later to Father Daigneault, too much of the pedagogue, focused on an unhealthy self-repression and strained will. Her way of coping with the imperfection she discovered in herself was, perhaps, to try and adopt a perfect manner of living the rule. The outward details were at least apparently more within one's control. To aim to be one's highest and best self, I quote, all the time, was an early way of dealing with her sense of inadequacy and her desire for God. It had the probable disadvantage of being unachievable, and it did not survive tidily from the spiritual direction she received from Father Daigneault. In 1899, she wrote to him that she was struggling with overwhelming thoughts that threatened to drown her, a choking sense of paralysis that threatened to overwhelm her when she thought about her responsibilities as vicar. And there's a lovely little line where she says, you know, she's trying to stay on top of this, but it seems to me that I might as well try to stop a runaway horse with a syllogism. In 1901, during her trip to South America, she wrote to him that the isolation she was then experiencing, the necessity of making important decisions without anyone to consult, was, quotes, a little crushing. But she was trying to trust God's providence and was never drowned, though it often felt to her as if she was slipping on a frozen sea. What might the experience of trying to slip or perhaps skate on a frozen sea be like? I was struck by Lorraine's photo this morning in her prayer. There was a wonderful photo of sunrise over a frozen sea, and you could see all the cracks and the crevices in the ice. Well, slipping or skating on a frozen sea would certainly be very insecure. The ice is full of crevasses. It bobs up and down with the waves underneath. It threatens, perhaps, to overturn or to melt. You would fall into the icy sea and drown. She tells Daigneault that her way of coping is not to think, not to feel, but just keep her head up and keep going. His encouragement helped her to overcome the choking thoughts and the waves that washed up over and over again. And she was able to advise her sisters in 1903 to do likewise, not to use the pickaxe of reason's search for certainty on the ice, but to trust the intuition of what she called the ilative sense. I'll come back to that phrase, which would bear them swiftly and lightly over the thin ice. The ice way would not bear if the mind rested, but the end is reached safely. The ilative sense, if you're not familiar with Cardinal Newman's thought, is a term for what, broadly speaking, we could call spiritual intuition, sensitive to the movement of the Holy Spirit, something that is neither reason nor feeling. It's something perhaps poised between the two. And Janet was reading Newman's Grammar of Assent at the time she was talking about this. And there's, again, more work to be done on how she was influenced by Newman's thought. At any rate, some of her vertigo left her as her confidence grew. At the end of her Latin American trip, she was able to write, "To tell the truth, I think you will find me a good bit changed. This journey has done me immense good, I hope, for my soul. Seeing so closely God's fatherly care, being so thrown entirely on my own, that is to say, on his resources, having to come out of myself and act and speak in my imperfect Spanish, regardless of shyness." But she always remembered the insecurity and the darkness of overwhelming thoughts, and perhaps continued to experience it from time to time. She shared with the community at Mount Anvil in 1904 that, next time please Janet, that God hides himself under such an awful silence that we are inclined to cry out, "For charity, truth, and justice's sake, manifest yourself." Yet God's response to this is unchanging. He continues to hide himself. The conclusion? Not to give up searching, but to seek him in this awful silence and in his hiddenness. Janet had once written to Daniel about her admiration for the Queen of Sheba and her extraordinary journey in search of the wisdom of Solomon. This sense of adventure into the unknown was picked up at Christmas 1908, when she reflected with her community on the incarnation as a divine adventure. Not merely, an alternative phrase that she was obviously playing with, a heroic undertaking. God himself, journeying into the unknown of human experience, to experience what it was like to be one of his own creatures, and that at a time when the whole creation was disorganized and in ruins. Now possibly she had in the back of her mind Ernest Shackleton's 1907-9 Nimrod expedition to Antarctica. There's nothing like looking up newspapers. Very interesting. The papers at the end of 1908 were full of reports of this early attempt to reach the South Pole. It had failed to reach its goal, but Shackleton had set the record at the time and penetrated further south than any other expedition so far. A heroic undertaking indeed, but in Janet's mind, not quite up to being a divine adventure. Our journey into the unknown God, next please Janet. Our journey into the unknown God is, she implies, a response to his journey into what may be called the unknown us. Such a voyage, ours, will be costly. This, by the way, is a picture of the Nimrod. Such a voyage, ours, will be costly. One would not expect a ship, newly painted when setting out on its journey, to arrive unmarked to port. On the contrary, it ought to be battered, its rigging in tatters, scratches around its paintwork. Such superficial damage is inevitable and will ensure our greater thankfulness at coming to port at all after what was evidently a worthwhile journey. So it was about letting go of the effort to be perfect. And this was a gradual process, but there was a jolt that helped it on. It happened during her prayer marathon with Goodyear, which I referred to in this morning. The 50-50 meditations on the Passion had been followed by 15 to 20 further meditations on the life of Our Lady. To be fair to Goodyear, this was at Janet's request, and she requested more. And so they started on a series of shared meditations on Pentecost. But then came the crash. Alban Goodyear described it to Maud Monaghan later as the dark night of the soul, which rather dramatises it, I think. Except that the dark night of the soul can be very ordinary, so perhaps it doesn't. Personally, I think Janet was simply exhausted. She'd had too much of a good thing. On the 4th of June, now this is very moving, on the 4th of June, she wrote to him, returning his points and his notes. I have had a bad time. Everything that has to do with prayer seems to have given way and become a complete blank. All I can see is my own sins and my hatefulness, and all I can think is whether I have deluded myself into thinking that I was meant for prayer at all, and wished for things that were not meant for me. I have quite a dread at present, almost a repulsion from anything to do with prayer, and it is like losing one's nerve for something in the natural order. The more one thinks of it, the worse it is. I am holding on by the penitential psalms and making efforts to pray. Janet, go to the next slide. In ashes. If it is to change for the better, God will have to make the next move, for I cannot. I know you will feel sorry for me. Every time I read this, it moves me. We tend to think of Janet as what she might have called the finished article. This has a lot to do with the way she has been presented to us in Monaghan's loving but idealised biography, and in all the other publications except perhaps Quinlan's. And also the spiritual quality and consistency of Janet's writings, which underpin the hagiographies, are testament to the strength of the image she projected in her lifetime, in spite of what might have been going on under the surface. She may well have been holy, but she was not a finished article. As I said before, she was only 57 when she died, and on the brink of a whole raft of new challenges, stresses, and responsibilities, from which her 3 years of journeys had been in part a pleasant, if challenging, distraction. In the essay on colour, she romanticises, as I told you, the 50th decade of her life as an age of white light, the fusion of all the colours that had gone before. Her experience of June 1909, when she was just 51, must have destroyed this pleasant, if only playfully intended, myth. However, the intensely bad time of the crash did not last long, and her retreat in December 1909 seems to have been a happy one. We get some insight into it in a letter to her from Alban Goodyear, to whom she had communicated her retreat resolutions. And he writes, echoing some of the things she has said to him. "I'm not sorry that you spent 3 days on the first week of the exercises. After all, it was a time of consolation for you rather than a harrowing of soul." It seems that we've left hell behind now. "The intended fruit of the first week," he wrote, "is a sense of one's utter dependence on God. And it cannot come to one more easily than by this sense of one's utter helplessness. It is a dependence," he said, "that appeals to God, who cannot possibly fail to respond, to keep me and do for and in me what is out of my power. In such dependence, we allow ourselves to be carried like a baby by God. This last, dear mother, is what I think you mean when you speak of the benefit of being quiet with God in prayer. The sight of ourselves," he means our human weakness, "is good for us, but it is also good to look at God and our Lord and let ourselves at times simply forget we have any existence at all." Dependence on God, the consolation that is at the heart of desolation at one's own insufficiencies. In a conference to the community in Malta in 1911, the nature lover in Janet found a metaphor that expressed her thought in a way anyone used to the lush pastures of the Rutland countryside of the 19th century might have found helpful in the hotter, drier landscape of the Mediterranean island, where the society had recently been established. Drawing from a reflection by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, she focuses on the wild flowers around them in Malta. Planted by God, she said, often unobserved by humans, they spring up in unlikely places. They grow any and everywhere, on hill or rock. They ask for very little water, sun, and soil. Day by day, moment by moment, the right thing is given to them. Depending on God and looking to Him for everything, our hope must be unkillable, like the flowers that grow in the bare crannies or on the ledge of a precipice. And she concludes in a very striking simile. Our hope thrives on the ledges of our greatest fears. It crosses on a bridge of rope chasms of despair. It trusts and expects the unexpected. It is just on these very uncertainties that it thrives. In March of 1909, Janet wrote to Goodyear in the context of a meditation on the crucifixion that it seems a supreme act of trust in God to wait and do nothing, and a sort of act of worship to lie fallow before Him like a field in winter. And at some point, possibly in the same year, she sent him a page of notes on her ideas of prayer. And one of the most attractive ways of praying for her at this time, next slide please, Janet, was the next one, thank you. To set out from some words such as Sea of Peace, Eternal Trinity, and to wade out and out into the bare thought of them until I lose my footing and am overwhelmed. Not, this time, overwhelmed in the sense of being drowned or destroyed. In June 1913, she addressed the Roehampton community just before departing for Australia. She quoted a line which might be an allusion to the Victorian poet Arthur Hugh Clough, or indeed to Wordsworth, or indeed, forgive me, allow me this, or indeed to Tennyson, his poem Ulysses. Can we have the next slide, please? Her line that she uses in her conference is there lies the land. And she's talking to them about going out, adventuring into God in prayer. Now, Wordsworth and Clough don't say there lies the land. Their poems begin where lies the land. Tennyson's poem has a line, there lies the port. But they're all elusive, echoing one another. Clough, in particular, Clough and Wordsworth reflect on voyaging by sea as heroic adventuring into uncertainty. And Clough admires the courage of the dripping sailor who fights with wind and wave, and on a reeling mast exults to bear and scorns to wish it past. And words like exult and scorn and those sorts of words are words that Janet often uses in her letters to people who are struggling with spiritual difficulties. You know, it's like when you fall off your horse, she says. You're delighted, aren't you? You jump up, you love it. You scorn to show that you're afraid to get back on that horse. Very Victorian. Tennyson's Ulysses rejects the limitations of his old age for some last adventure. And Ulysses says in the poem, there lies the port, the vessel puffs her sail, there gloom the dark, broad seas. 'Tis not too late to seek a newer world. That which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will. Famous last line, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. So, a bit of fun, but I really do think those are allusions that are in her mind. She comments in her talk to Roehampton, we talk about self-surrender, but actually we look for substantial bail, valid securities, reliable guarantees, very nice financial language. But it is not that. It is the contrary, believing without security, trusting without seeing, that matter. The wonder and the beauty of it, next slide please, is that God says, let me do it. And the wonderful unintelligence is that we answer, but let me see. Instead, she said, we must accept that we won't see, but in hope, like Clough's or Tennyson's or Wordsworth's, I haven't told you about Goethe's, like their mariners, we must go beyond all felt certainty, all probability, to the very outer edge of possibility. This, I think, God loves and blesses. What is particularly interesting is the context of these comments. A conference in which she almost seems to be laughing at her earlier self. She wonders what it is that prevents us from giving ourselves completely, as Ignatius desires, to God. And among other inhibitions, she identified the zeal to be always in the right, the longing for certainty, the desire to feel perfectly secure about everything, the effort we make to make things smooth by going about alert, assured, perfected, the way we want to complete everything with a finish. Even the effort to reveal oneself with limpid sincerity, to be quite true, a desire that she had often felt and stated to her spiritual directors, to communities, to everybody. Even that desire, she thought now, was misplaced. The only peace in life is accepting uncertainty. This is the real poverty which would enable us one day to be able to transform Clough's sailor's question, where lies the land, to there lies the land. That That is Janet as a daring mariner. And tomorrow we will find out, did she get there? Thank you.